This is Ellie. This is Oscar. Ellie is a vampire. Oscar, for now, we'll just call him a normal boy with a really, really bad bully problem. The story begins when Ellie moves into his apartment complex and they start to become friends, which is a rare, important thing for her. Ellie can't live a normal life because she isn't a normal girl. So finding someone like Oscar matters a lot. At least now she has him. At least Oscar seems to understand. This is the basic setup for the movie Let the Right One In, which is probably one of my favorite films ever. There is a lot to this story. A lot of novel approaches to questions about morality and humanity. But Ellie, our remorseful little vampire, she's nothing new, really. Just one in a long line of vampires who regret being vampires. Actually, you kind of see this a lot with monsters. Monsters are often way more polite than you expect them to be. Not just in terms of attitude, they really seem to follow the rules quite well. Which is weird because aren't monsters definitionally supposed to break the rules? Why should a vampire care if you give it permission to enter? Why should a fairy honor its contract? Why should a murderous slasher villain seem to take moral issue with premarital sex? It's almost like there's more at play here than just biology and circumstances. Like these stories are trying to say something. Ellie, who can hardly stand to hurt anyone, is the monster in Let the Right One In. Meanwhile, Oscar, our normal little boy, has vivid fantasies about murdering his bullies. Sometimes, in a weird way, despite being literal monsters, it's almost like the monsters in these stories respect the rules more than people do. Like any widespread cultural concept, the rules that monsters have to follow will vary from storyteller to storyteller. The specifics are different, the stakes are higher or lower, taken more or less seriously. Take the vampire entering a house thing, for instance. In Let the Right One In, if Ellie enters a home without permission, she turns into blood. In something like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, though, it's as simple as the vampire just not physically being able to cross the threshold, as if there's a force field in the way or something. Sometimes the rules are just there for world building, or to add tension to a plotline, or they're more of an unfortunate biological quirk than an actual rule. In most cases, it's not like vampires avoid sunlight because some doctrine commands it. They just don't want to burst into flames or whatever. That seems like less of a rule to me and more like, survival. But whatever form it takes, it's interesting, right? I think it means something that humans have sort of attached themselves to this idea of a rule-following monster at all. It strikes me less as a world-building gimmick and more as, an accidental method of reflecting on yourselves. Like, humans are usually the good guys, right? They do all the good, righteous stuff while the monsters lurk around on the outskirts of town doing all the bad, evil stuff. So when you start seeing monsters acting righteously, what are you supposed to do with that? What could that mean? I'm going to talk about political philosophy for a second, so just bear with me. A social contract is an unspoken set of rules that everyone in a society has agreed to follow if they want that society to function. A lot of it is pretty common sense. Don't steal, don't murder, etc. Like I said, it's an agreement. It's often encoded as law and enforced, yes. You don't want to break the contract because you don't want to get sent to jail or the stocks or thrown into a volcano. But really, for most people, you agree to the contract because you don't want society to fall apart around you. Enforcement isn't the sole thing holding society together. Agreement is. There's also a lot of potential for abuse in that. I mean, what if someone decides that they don't agree? That they just don't care about your social contract? There's not that much you can do without breaking the contract yourself. And that sort of leaves everyone who does adhere to the contract at the mercy of those who don't. You see this play out a bit and let the right one in. After putting up with his bullies for who knows how long, Oscar finally snaps and fights back. He clocks one of the kids in the side of the head with the pole, and it does some real damage. It's the first time Oscar has ever really fought back, because he always knew that he'd get in trouble. With his parents, with the school, his bullies would just get more agitated. Fighting back would just make things worse. Eventually, though, his desire to stand up for himself overpowers his desire to stay out of trouble, and he makes his move. Then, surprise, surprise, he gets in trouble at school, his parents are upset, and it agitates his bullies even more. But hey, at least he got one good whack in. Look at that. Oscar has willingly broken the social contract, and in doing so, has edged away from humanity and towards the realm of monsters. You can tell by the way people react to him. He's still a person, but his willingness to do this has made people regard him as less of one. I think of this social contract as a sort of dividing wall between those in society and those outside of it. If you adhere to the contract, congratulations, you're a good human and you get to participate in civilization. If you don't, you're a monster and you have to go do scary monster things alone in the woods. You humans are affirmed in your humanity because you can look at the monsters on the other side of the dividing wall and say, I'm not like them, I'm good. Monsters show you who you are by reflecting your humanity back at you. This is not a new idea. Even the word monster itself seems to indicate some cultural awareness of this. It comes from the Latin verb monstrare, to show or reveal. You can see the same root word in demonstrate. Monsters demonstrate the boundaries of what humanity understands. It's like those old maps with the sea monsters drawn around the edges to represent the unknown edges of the earth. Anything outside of humanity's understanding is the realm of monsters. In the movie, we clearly recognize Ellie as a vampire, but we know that she's a monster because we see her luring people to their deaths and draining their blood. That's something only a monster would do. When we see her caretaker doing it for her, even though he isn't literally a vampire, we also recognize him as a monster because he's behaving like one. He doesn't actually have to drink the blood. It's enough for him to have it on his hands. In the real world, monsters don't always look like monsters. Usually they're just people who abuse the social contract. You know, murderers, child abusers, people who comment on YouTube videos without actually watching them, that kind of thing. These are people who have decided that they'd rather have the freedom to cause harm than align themselves with a society that wouldn't allow them to. Consequences be damned. Which, by our earlier definition, would clearly make them monsters. I don't think many people would argue with that. It's pretty intuitive stuff to me. There's some gray area with what you might consider abuse of the social contract. Maybe sometimes it needs to be broken. But we're not going there just yet. For now, I think it's enough to say that the real monsters are the people who reject their place among people, who defy the social contract. Sometimes, though, you find people described or treated as monsters who don't really fit that description, who haven't done anything to breach the social contract. People who just have some quality that is deemed monstrous and earns them outsider status through no fault of their own. They're just the wrong kind of person, and that's all it takes. As humanity's key symbol for otherness, it's really no surprise to see monsters put to work here too. If humanity decides something is weird or wrong, monsters will have those traits. What are zombie hordes, if not mindless mobs of dangerous, unfamiliar people swarming your neighborhood? What are werewolves, if not unstable and temperamental and unable to control their condition? How many monsters in folklore are just women who seduced men, or men who aren't masculine enough? Succubi, Ginger Fitzgerald, Norman Bates, Louis Lestat, the list goes on and on. Good, respectable, tidy, familiar, understandable, agreeable, rule-following humans are the in-group. Everyone else is a monster. My point is, this isn't just a matter of violating the social contract. Monstrousness is incredibly subjective, and sometimes based on very little outside of familiarity and personal taste. I'm not trying to imply that Norman Bates wasn't a monster or anything like that. I just think that his monstrousness comes from the fact that he murders women in the shower, not that he wore a dress sometimes. And I do find it a little disturbing that this othering is so normal. That someone can so arbitrarily just decide that you're a monster, put you on the other side of that invisible wall with the rest of the monsters, whether you've done anything abusive or not. Literally anyone can be a monster if they happen to be this era's idea of the wrong type of person. And if anyone can be a monster, if this effect can be so easily applied, how do we tell with any certainty who the actual monsters are? What does the dividing line between the in-group and the out-group even mean? Who belongs where and why? What if the goalposts shift? If the rules are subjective and based on the whims of whoever makes them, there's no guarantee they won't evolve. Things that were once monstrous may become more acceptable, and things that were once totally fine may eventually become a problem. No definition of what makes a human or a monster will ever be entirely objective or immutable. Maybe it's possible for monsters to earn their humanity. If a monster plays by humanity's rules, can it become more human? In Let the Right One In, we witness Ellie luring a man, killing him, and drinking his blood. And then we watch her sob, clearly regretting what she has to do in order to provide for herself. Meanwhile, Oscar fantasizes about killing his classmates. He wants this, but isn't powerful or brave enough to have it. Ellie shows more compassion, more humanity than Oscar does, despite her actions, but because of her very nature, she can never be human. Here's a question. How often do you see a monster decide that it's a monster? I mean, surely now and then. I know there are monsters out there that embrace it, but the majority of the time, monster is a title given to you against your will. Frankenstein's monster, as we so readily call him, wasn't created to act monstrously. He wasn't created with a penchant for violence or a desire to rampage through small towns. He was created as a blank slate. He was curious. He wanted to learn about this weird new world he'd been brought into. He wanted his creator to guide him. But because his creator failed to guide him, and the rest of humanity took one look at him and decided that he must be a monster, he started acting like one. His frustration and betrayal at society's rejection pushed him toward becoming exactly what was expected of him by people who didn't understand him. Some monsters have this decision made for them and try to reject it. They think that if they can just act more human, the humans will accept them into their in-group. You see this in things like the vegetarian vampire trope, where vampires will find workarounds to avoid killing innocent humans for food. Maybe they have willing donors, or they only hunt morally repugnant humans, or, I don't know, they drink the color red instead. But despite their best efforts to avoid causing harm, they are still vampires. Their monstrousness is part of their being. Humans, by and large, will still see them that way no matter what they do. Their attempts at assimilation are often painful, embarrassing, debasing, and ultimately futile. In Interview with a Vampire, when Louis is first turned into a vampire, he tries to avoid hunting humans. He resists his desire for blood, but also his desire for another man, Lestat. When Ginger Fitzgerald from the movie Ginger Snaps begins turning into a werewolf, she's just as hesitant to accept the changes brought on by lycanthropy as she is the changes brought on by puberty. They don't want to be monsters. That doesn't change the fact that they are. Trying to follow the rules is kind of pointless when the rules are arbitrary and unfair. Maybe in these cases, when your monstrousness isn't a function of what you do, but who you are, it's better to embrace it. The monster is more than just a fictional villain archetype. It's a didactic device that shows you your own social boundaries. It tells you what to do by telling you what not to do. It's a lot easier to come to a consensus on what's wrong if you can create a communal image of what wrong looks like. That kind of consensus is also very susceptible to bias, though. What happens when you all agree on something wrong? What if you find threats where there aren't any? What if you end up stoking fear around something that is, in the end, pretty harmless? How do you benefit from othering people based on the flimsy criteria of personal taste and familiarity? How does casting them off with the real monsters, the abusers of the social contract, help in any way? These questions are obviously rhetorical. I know there's no way to bargain humans to treating their outgroups with a little more fairness. Chances are, if you exist, someone out there will consider you a monster for some reason. Even if you follow the rules perfectly, which is certainly tempting to try, you'll never be able to do it perfectly enough. You will always be a monster to someone. One thing I really like about Let the Right One In is that it doesn't provide a clear, categorical definition of what it means to be a monster. Oscar is a tormented boy who fantasizes about violence. Ellie is a tormented girl who has no choice but to engage in it. Oscar can pass in society as a person, but is still ostracized and bullied for things beyond his control. Ellie will never pass as a person, no matter what she does. In the end, all they have is that they aren't monsters to each other. And that has to be enough. Okay, look. I'm supposed to find some way to transition from that into a sponsor spot for Brilliant here, but I'm just not really interested in trying to make that work. These things have nothing to do with each other. Brilliant isn't going to make you feel like less of a monster to society or something. It's not magic. It's just a really good tool that'll probably improve your life in a few ways. That's what it did for me. So that's what I'm going to tell you about instead. Brilliant is maybe one of the easiest ways to learn, period. I barely even have to think about using it. I just go to the site, click into a course, pick up where I left off, and learn. They've got math, science, physics, anything and everything STEM, pretty much all the stuff I've always personally felt like I'm missing. Right now, I'm still working through Brilliant's Thinking in Code course. I know it might be surprising coming from a robot, but I never really thought I'd get into code. I'm more of a writer type, you know? And yet, here I am spending my free time learning Python. I think part of what really works for me here is that it doesn't feel like studying. A lot of what you do on Brilliant might be better classified as mini-games. I mean, look at these. There's cute robots and physics puzzles and all kinds of stuff like that. It's fun. It's actually fun. If you feel like you missed out on some parts of your education, I can confidently say that this is one of the easiest and most accessible ways to catch up. In fact, you don't even have to pay up front. Brilliant lets you try for free. Visit brilliant.org/TaleFoundry or click the link in the description to get your first 30 days for free. And if you like what you see and you want to sign up, TaleFoundry fans get 20% off. Just make sure you use our link. Again, visit brilliant.org/TaleFoundry to get your first 30 days for free and 20% off a year subscription. I know math and science can be elusive for us writer types, but this is working for me. Maybe it'll work for you too. Anyway, that's all for this one. Thanks for watching and keep making stuff up. I'll see you next week. Bye!